Dobrodošli na Fakultet političkih nauka Univerziteta u Banjaluci. Danas imamo zadovoljstvo da u saradnji sa Centrom za društveno-politička istraživanja Republike Srpske organizujemo predavanje Davida Engelsa, jednog od značajnijih filozofa mlađe generacije, čoveka koji nam nudi informacije i znanje o jednoj Evropi koju ne možete da vidite u mainstream medijima, niti možete da čujete taj glas Evrope, bar ga niste mogli da čujete godinama. U tom kontekstu pričati o identitetu i politici u Evropi je beskrajno potrebno nama, koji smo u fazi da se samo određujemo i prema Zapadu i prema Evropi i na taj način definišemo i nekakve svoje političke, a ne samo naučne stavove. Veliko mi je zadovoljstvo što je David Engels sa nama, a posebno mi je zadovoljstvo što to radimo sa našom bratskom institucijom sa kojom imamo uspostavljenu zvaničnu saradnju, a to je Centar za društveno-politička istraživanja. To je jedna bitna institucija sa kojom će, nadam se, u budućnosti sarađivati mnogi od vas, naših studenata. Mr. Engels, thank you for your coming. This faculty and university, it's not old, we are young, but we are dynamic, and we want to learn. And you are person who are welcome here, and please, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm really honored to be able to be here in Bàњaluka today and to be able to speak a little bit about some of my recent ideas about identity, but also about conservatism at the occasion of the publication of the Serbian translation of my book, Defending the European Civilization. So those who expected perhaps that I give a summary of the book, I could deceive you, will speak rather a little bit about other questions, like essentially what conservatism means in a European context. But as you will see very quickly, there will be a strong link, of course, to the content of the book. And what I will try to tell you this afternoon or this evening is in a certain way some form of prolegomena to this work. So maybe it is a question of age, maybe of personal experience, but perhaps it is also a reflection of the current state of our Western late civilization. I believe less and less in the possibility of a fundamental political renewal of our culture, and certainly not through a European Union that increasingly reveals itself as antagonistic to the true Western tradition in every essential respect, despite or perhaps because of its incessant moralizing. Firstly, many readers will probably know that as a student of Hegel, Spengler, or Toynbee, I am firmly convinced that all great civilizations are mortal and, after fully realizing their potential, become inwardly exhausted and gradually fossilize. Hence, there is no reason to assume that our own European civilization would be exempt from this fate, which, as historical analogies suggest, now seems to be approaching rather swiftly. Secondly, after even the prospect that the West might, after all, still experience a final, somewhat Augustan synthesis, as I've outlined in my book, Le Déclin, is only conditionally an optimistic one. And the expectation of such a final resurgence, however realistic and perhaps least bad as a future scenario, must not be confused with any inner enthusiasm in the face of it. Even the contemporaries of Augustus' Principate were fully aware of the retrospective, nostalgic, and ultimately somewhat self-deceptive nature of those decades of the Pax Augusta. And if the early imperial authors celebrated with genuine fervor the golden age of the Augustan Restoration, distinguishing it from the ghastly symptoms of decline of the late Roman Republic, they were nonetheless acutely aware that this last and in every respect neoclassical flowering had been purchased at the price of a definitive renunciation of political freedom and of genuine artistic or intellectual creativity. Rome's inner renewal ultimately remained an elite phenomenon, one that could not and perhaps should not be understood as truly shared by the broad masses who had long since grown accustomed to the politics of bread and circuses, panem et circenses. Hence, in the Europe of the 21st century, the future will not be very different, as can already be foreseen now. The uprooted, infantilized, heterogeneous, and largely materialistic masses that populate our great cities will never again be transformed into those spiritually and culturally creative, complex, and resilient peoples who once produced the outer beauty and the inner depth of epochs such as the Romanesque, the Gothic, the Renaissance, or the Baroque. Thirdly, allow me to say a word about the reality of modern conservatism. To speak of the fluid transition between idealism and opportunism, between belief and action, in short, between being and appearance, is indeed extremely delicate, especially since all generalizations risk being unfair in individual cases. Yet, in case of doubt, we must prefer those who wish to preserve our Western civilization to those who seek to destroy it, whatever the true motives behind either may be. But it should be evident to any observer that even most so-called conservatives are often driven by all too human motives, and that the personality concealed behind the well-chosen words all too rarely corresponds to the exemplary character suggested by them. This too belongs, of course, to the condition humaine, to be sure, but it is nonetheless inexcusable in our times, when Western culture is approaching its complete dissolution with giant strides. There are, it seems to me, two main reasons for this state of affairs. On the one hand, the conservative movement is increasingly torn apart as the boundaries of what is politically possible continue to shrink. Unwelcome opinions are ever more readily relegated by the mass media to the so-called far right, where ultra-liberals and Christian socialists, where sovereigntists and Western patriots, where libertarians and traditional Catholics, monarchists and Republicans now find themselves confined together as far right. What then does the term far right even mean anymore? On the other hand, the majority of those who find themselves on the far right, whether they admit it or not, also become mere historical products of that spiritual exhaustion of the West, a phenomenon that cannot be adequately described without invoking the term de-Christianization. The misguided historicization of spirituality and the false belief that religion is or should be a purely private matter have led to a complete alienation of Europeans from transcendence, both individually and collectively. What then is the result? Even modern conservatives are usually wholly absorbed in the pursuit of social utopias, acting with the best of consciences, yet at the cost of denying what should in fact define them, the concern for inner salvation in every circumstance of life, taking precedence over concerns for mere outer salvation. Without this fundamental conviction, everything else must remain mere piecemeal, if it is not even unconsciously transformed into its opposite. Genuine human role models, those whose ambition extends beyond improving economic or social indicators, to say nothing of those merely concerned with posts and networks, and whose personality radiates not only competence but also true inner calm, integrity, and closeness to God, those genuine human role models are exceedingly rare today. Such a situation can perhaps be tolerated by left liberals who make no secret of their materialistic convictions, but for genuine conservatives, the extinction of transcendence is a fatal catastrophe. A conservatism that treats the commitment to transcendence as optional rather than as the very source of its convictions, condemns itself to argue within the ideological framework of the left, and thus sooner or later to degenerate into a mere brake of a vehicle whose steering wheel is held by someone else. So these introductory words may also explain why what once filled me with horror a few years ago, the decline of the West, now increasingly seems to me a mere external matter. Not because I would deny or minimize the catastrophe that the decline of the West represents in every respect, but rather because in the meantime, the true meaning of what inner life is has opened itself ever more clearly to me. And in the process has also cast a new light of what the West once actually meant, how its decline should be understood today, and what might still be expected for the future. Admittedly, even without recourse to transcendence, one can recognize the simple fact that all the essential indicators of a civilization's health are now in deep crisis. Whether we speak of the disintegration of the family, demographic decline, the erosion of traditional moral concepts, the hatred of one's own civilization, the dismantling of the middle class, the banalization of crime, or the decay of robust participatory political structures in favor of billionaire socialism. Everywhere we encounter a fundamental identity crisis. Yet this is only a symptom of a deeper crisis of faith. The true roots of the present misery cannot be remedied by merely combating its outward manifestations through countless support programs. For even if such measures are indispensable, they treat only the symptoms, not the disease itself. A glance at Poland or Hungary makes this clear. Their governments have at best succeeded in slowing the decline somewhat, but by no means in reversing the underlying self-destructive tendencies. The real malady, however, lies in the fact that for many centuries, the Westerner has increasingly turned away from transcendence, the very source that once shaped and nourished every aspect of his culture. Every advanced civilization passes through the two phases often described as culture and civilization, and thus through the antithetical relation between faith and science, God and world, inwardness and outwardness, art and industry, individual and mass, honor and money, tradition and construction, in short, transcendence and materialism. The dismantling of the former in favor of the latter usually proceeds so gradually that the outward form of a transcendent society can persist, upheld by habit and convention for centuries, after its animating spirit has already faded. Sooner or later, however, no matter what material progress may have been achieved in the meantime, the entire edifice of civilization must harden and then collapse after a brief quasi-Augustan synthesis. This development too cannot be stopped, for the path inward toward not merely formal but lived awareness and transcendence cannot be decreed by law. There can, of course, be better or worse conditions for self-conversion, yet ultimately the turn towards the within can never be imposed from without. This is especially evident in our own times, when transcendence has been almost entirely and consciously excluded from the everyday horizon of Westerners, for whom the thought of God and of their own soul is, at best, uninteresting and more often simply ridiculous. Nevertheless, the longing for the one must in the end arise from within. It can be awakened only by the example of a genuinely lived faith, an example that is so dramatically absent today, particularly in conservative circles. But what does transcendence mean? It means the recognition that the imperfection of this world compels us to trace its origin to a source beyond it. An origin not to be naively understood as a one-time creator God, but as a principle of being and unity standing above and outside all earthly things, eternal, infinite, and supratemporal. Its being unfolds, perceptible to us only within the illusory framework of time and natural law, in the created existence of the world, whose innumerable living beings derive their being from it. This being is not limited to their composition of created yet transient matter, but extends also to their capacities for self-preservation, reproduction, self-awareness, love, and thought. These qualities reach their culmination in the human being, who alone among all creatures possesses the ability to recognize transcendence, a recognition that also implies the possibility of rejecting it, and which culminates in the desperate desire to become one with the divine. The very existence of this longing proves that humanity possesses a power of approach to transcendence, at least step by step, and that this power must therefore be consubstantial with it. This is what we commonly call the soul, which finds its biblical expression in the sentence that man was created in the image of God. The soul, however, must not be confused with personality or consciousness. It is rather a share in divine eternity itself, temporarily fragmented and separated by the material conditions of our existence in the world of multiplicity, yet also guiding these conditions with the aim of returning wholly to the primordial source and entering into eternal immortality. Nor should the soul be understood dualistically as the victim of matter. Rather, matter must be understood as a voluntarily chosen and even created condition through which the soul, and thus an aspect of divinity, seeks to realize its ultimate goal in countless variations. This goal is the realization of a unity in which eternal state and eternal process coincide, without God thereby ceasing to stand outside the world. This striving can ultimately be summed up only in the words, God is love. And under that familiar phrase, there lie hidden infinite depths of ontological meaning. The insight into this metaphysical foundation of existence, an insight whose realization has shaped every age and every society in one form or another, carries several fundamental consequences for humanity. The first is the displacement of the center of existence from this world to the hereafter. The guiding principle must not be the pursuit of temporary, purely material advantages in the here and now, but the longing for man's union with God, not through external religious laws, but through the realization that only the soul is the eternal and indestructible element within man himself, and that it must be regarded as consubstantial with God. The greatest happiness, therefore, lies in the conscious unification with him already here and now, in that state of unio mystica, which offers a fulfillment surpassing all material riches, because it both includes and transcends them. For he who strives with all his strength to merge into the love of God, who comes to recognize that the striving for this love, the love itself and God are but different names for the same principle, will also discover within it everything else as potentiality. This applies equally to his own self. Only he who can strip away all that is temporary and recognize as the true core of his being that eternal power from which he has come forth and by which he is sustained, can find himself in that very power and perceive himself, as it were, as a thought of God, endowed within the illusion of time with the power of self-determination, yet fixed from eternity in the eyes of the eternal. The thoughts sketched here can, of course, be understood and realized in many different ways. Even if the goal is always the same, the paths toward it are manifold, each with its own justification and inner logic. And though there may be detours and errors, our judgment must remain deeply subjective, tempered by the realization that, sub specie eternitatis, even the greatest aberrations will ultimately serve ad majorem Dei gloria. For us Westerners, however, this path unquestionably leads through Christianity, the tradition into which we were born by God's will and whose foundations we breathe with every fiber of our being. Even in rejecting Christianity, Western civilization continues to be shaped by its categories of thought and action and needs them as a fish needs water. Anyone who seeks to approach the highest, both in God and within himself, will therefore find it most natural to do so by returning to Christianity. He will also recognize that this path is prescribed for him just as surely as those assigned by family, homeland, or gender, though not in the sense of a passive resignation, but of a voluntary acceptance, without which no true transcendence is possible, and which otherwise remains trapped in mere negation. Admittedly, Christianity too has developed historically and bears the marks not only of its rootedness in Western civilization, and not, for instance, in East Asian or sub-Saharan African societies, but also of its confessional fragmentation and contemporary political theological distortions. Thus, a return to transcendence now means, more than ever, the search for the true essence of the Christian faith, in the sense of the foundations outlined above, together with a renewed act of trust. Trust not only in that absolute truth, which can be obscured but never destroyed, but also in the collective labor of the countless generations of our ancestors who, through their manifold endeavors, have woven the Christian faith into that vast and spiritual and cultural tapestry which we can still admire today. It would lead too far to attempt a theological elaboration of these reflections here, yet experience shows that precisely those dogmas of the Christian faith, which are most often dismissed as outdated or merely symbolic, contain, upon closer examination, the most profound secrets of transcendence. Above all stands, of course, Jesus Christ himself, who rightly became the center of the new faith, not merely because of his teachings, but above all because of his person. In him, the otherwise fragmentary human striving towards divinization was fulfilled in its most complete form, so that the disciples were confronted in their own hic et nunc with an otherworldly experience of such shattering power that without it, the persuasive force of Christianity would be inconceivable. This radical otherness has since manifested itself again and again in apostles, martyrs, thinkers, saints, and undoubtedly also in countless otherwise unknown human beings, both within and beyond Christianity. And it continues to be a witness that the highest aim of our earthly existence is not a passive submission to an imposed corpus of rules, but a conscious union with the highest. From that union must then logically flow an active love for all other manifestations of the one, not as a duty, but as an irresistible inner necessity. The modern conservative now stands at a crossroads. If his concern is merely the historical preservation of what already exists, he will increasingly find himself compelled not to oppose, but to side with those very aberrations that ultimately signify not the flourishing, but rather the decline of our civilization. In the interwar period, some conservatives could still wish, in good conscience, to preserve the last remnants of the Ancien Regime, traces of which occasionally reach back into the pre-revolutionary world, and to dismiss the history of the preceding decades of the 19th century as a regrettable but passing accident. Today, however, such an act of preservation is no longer possible. Apart from a few remaining echoes, everything that once constituted the authentic West has been erased or perverted. And the accelerating disintegration we perceive in recent years is merely the outcome of an exponential process whose roots reach far deeper into the past. Anyone who seriously believes, as many people in Western Europe do, that the good old 1980s represent something both possible and worthwhile to preserve will find little, perhaps nothing at all, in common with the kind of conservatism advocated here. The moral, economic, and cultural liberalism that made the year 2025 possible does not originate in 2001, nor in 1989, nor in 1945, or in 1918, or in 1870, or 1848, and even not in 1789. From this perspective, even the French Revolution is only a symptom, not a reason, not a cause. The true rupture lies much earlier. Already in the Middle Ages, the decisive civilizational fracture was prefigured in the dispute between realists and nominalists, a fracture that over the centuries would widen and deepen until it transformed the very face of our civilization. The present collapse of the West thus has deep roots. the apparent acceleration of decline in recent decades can be explained by the fact that the spiritual erosion of our culture was long offset by a residual sense of decency, a moral substratum expressed in deliberately vague formulas like, we don't do that here, or this is how it should be done. Its intellectual formulation was later given by the Böckenförde paradoxon, according to which the modern state rests upon moral foundation that it cannot itself guarantee. For the conservative, therefore, the following applies. Anyone who naively wishes to return to the moment when, metaphorically speaking, the first beams of the house came crashing through the ceiling, without asking when the first maintenance work was neglected, has understood neither architecture nor social dynamics. This also reveals the only true alternative to that liberal conservatism, which seeks to preserve a state of affairs already hollowed out from within, namely a conservatism that reaches back much further into history, or better yet, one that has eternity itself in view, and that selects from the vast heritage of our development only those elements untainted by the fundamental evil of materialism, those that spring instead from an insight into transcendence, as I described at the outset. But what does this mean in concrete terms? In my view, two consequences follow from such a conviction. First, we must learn to understand the failures of Western civilization as a logical and indeed morphologically necessary consequence of our original dispositions, and to internalize this understanding. Because there remains much of salvation history within the modern belief in progress. The priest has often been replaced by the expert. The Faustian urge no longer builds heaven-reaching cathedrals, but skyscrapers. The salvation of the soul has been replaced by the salvation of the planet. The missionary zeal to convert the unbeliever has been transformed into a campaign to spread human rights. Original sin has given way to a negative anthropology. And even the globalist ambitions of our time still conceal a remnant of the energies that once animated the inner strength of the Holy Roman Empire. Our present decline is no accident, but the logical consequence of our own inner predispositions. If we wish to take pride in the European world conquest of the 19th century, as so many do, we must not complain when the very instruments of power devised by the Europeans are now turned against them, just as those who celebrated the destruction of the church as the emancipation of the individual must not now shed crocodile tears over the unchained hedonism and materialism that followed. If we wish to preserve what remains of the West as a living inheritance, we must begin to understand its development holistically and recognize that though one may take pride in the Faustian impulse that still underlies even our aberrations, what is truly valuable in our civilization cannot be reduced to that inwardly directionless striving. In other words, yes, the skyscraper too springs from this typically European Faustian spirit and has a right to stand beside the cathedral tower as a testament to human greatness. But there must be no doubt which of the two represents the healthier creation. This leads to the second point. Such an insight implies that we may even have to part with the very term conservatism and replace it with the idea of transcendentalism. For if there is nothing left worth conserving, only the return to transcendence can provide a new and at the same time eternal framework in which it is worth living, not only for society as a whole, but also for the individual. And this is another essential realization. Society as a whole can scarcely be reformed, at least not in the short or medium term. Even if reform should occur, it will not arise from within, but only under the pressure of external forces that lie largely beyond our control. It is therefore our duty, alongside whatever limited political activity remains possible, to focus increasingly on the private sphere, to build parallel societies in which we may live according to our ideals outside the reach of the prevailing system. And I have outlined such an approach in my book, Que faire, What is to be done. But what then should be the guiding principles of such a Hesperialist, that is Western transcendentalism, as I've outlined it in the book? Well, from the path inwards, there necessarily follows also a path outwards. And it seems to me that precisely this approach may well be not only the truest, but also the only logically consistent way to a final justification of a Western Hesperialist conservatism, or rather to a reinterpretation of conservatism, at the end of which there may even emerge the necessity of abandoning the very term conservatism. Whoever recognizes that there exists not only a transcendent God, but also within himself an immortal core of being consubstantial with that divinity, cannot help but devote the rest of his life to approaching this mystery, to allowing himself to be wholly permeated by that divine being, that is, to pursuing an imitatio Christi in the fullest and most authentic sense. Yet, unlike the pursuit of personal advantage, this spiritual unfolding is by no means an egoist's enterprise. For within the soul of each individual, there is always the struggle of the whole and for the whole. If even a spark of our soul is of divine nature, it ultimately contains the whole of God. And where the whole of God is present, there too is everything that has proceeded from him, at least as potentiality. The sacrifice of the particular and the temporal in order to penetrate the universal and eternal is therefore only apparently a sacrifice. For everything, including one's individuality, is already contained within that very universality. He who offers himself up to be wholly absorbed in God gains himself back again in manifold potency and transcendence. The realization of one's own godlikeness also leads to the understanding that all other human beings are spark of this same divine unity. And ultimately variations of one's own being that differ only by degree. Whoever finds God within himself cannot fail to recognize him in his neighbor. From this follows the necessity of compassion and love for one's neighbor, not as for an other, but as for one who is essentially identical with oneself, whose suffering and greatness alike mirror one's own. Nothing else is meant by the commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It refers to that all-encompassing love which constitutes the very being of God and which also becomes ours as we walk this path. This love, however, is not what is commonly understood as social justice, but rather an inner sympathy with a kindred destiny, one whose goal is not material prosperity, but the deepening of our perception of the mystical path. What must be loved in the neighbor is not an uncritical acceptance of his present state, but compassion for his struggle to strip away everything that separates us from the vision of God. This does not exclude active social help, of course, but it renders such help incidental rather than essential to neighborly love. The earthly, though not even in itself being a divine creation, must never obscure the view of the essential. Thus, the attempt to remove all material obstacles to human happiness must appear misguided in its priority, since it is precisely the experience of contingency, suffering, and limitation that enables us to pass from the inessential to the real. If the world were perfect, time and space, as well as general and individual being, would either collapse into the nothingness of maximum entropy, or else take the place of God, and thus compel creation to begin anew. Whoever seeks God within himself must therefore be grateful for every opportunity of self-mortification, not in the sense of artificial self-punishment, but as a constant reminder that the true goal lies within, not without. Although this love is all-embracing in its essence, it must nevertheless be understood as graduated, in view of both our material limitations and the laws of nature. Whether we speak of the hermit withdrawing into solitude, the monk entering a religious order, the priest entrusted with a congregation, or the individual bearing responsibility for a family, or at least of a circle of friends or colleagues, We are always and everywhere conditioned in our actions by the limits and bonds set for us. Yet this conditionality can be misunderstood as a limitation or restriction only by those who hold a purely utopian, materialistic view of the world. Those who do not begin from the individual, but from a chimerical, boundless great whole, which in the end signifies nothingness. The heavenly Jerusalem is not a state to be attained here, but rather striving, an effort to radiate outward the inner joy that springs from our divine nature. A striving, I say, not a duty, for it lies in the very nature of happiness and bliss to wish to draw others into its light. Whoever must strive to do so has already missed the point. The absolute can therefore only be communicated concentrically to one's immediate neighbor. Whoever sees this as a limitation to accidental external circumstances has understood nothing of the correspondence between the greatest and the smallest. Hence the command, already found in the New Testament, to care first for the nearest neighbor, not the farthest. That ordo caritatis, which until quite recently formed the unshakable basis of every Christian social order, before it was replaced by a purely materialistic, utopian vision of society. Here we also touch, finally, upon the political aspect of a reconstruction of conservatism in the spirit of Christian transcendentalism. Those who have understood what I've tried to outline so far will readily reduce from it the principles by which their priorities should be ordered. These include, first, acceptance of one's own body with all its imperfections and infirmities, in contrast to the dangerous Gnostic illusion of transhumanism. Second, affirmation of one's own given sex, in contrast to the hybris of gender ideology. Third, love for our bodily and spiritual ancestors as a grateful acceptance of the task bequeathed to us, in contrast to the conscious uprooting of the individual masquerading as his liberation or deconstruction. Fourth, marriage between men and women as the sublimation of sexuality in the service of mutual growth and family formation and the common path towards God, in contrast to the materialistic aberrations of hedonism and gender theory. Loving responsibility for one's own children as a microcosmic reflection of a divine love, fulfillment of our natural vocation and of the rhythm of the generations, in contrast to the outsourcing of education and the cult of eternal youth. Then we have absolute respect for life and for death alike as central forms of the human encounter with contingency, in contrast to the trivialization of abortion and euthanasia. Appreciation of personal initiative as a means of awakening to one's own responsibility, in contrast to the coercive tutelage of the socialist state. A sense of concentric social responsibility for one's neighbor, in contrast to both ultraliberalism and sentimentalist long-distance love. Love for one's homeland, nation, and civilization, and finally for humanity, as the concentric framework of self-development, expanding from the smallest to the greatest, in contrast to uprooted cosmopolitanism, which knows only atomized individuals collectivized in their homogenized diversity. Loving care for the natural world as a divine creation entrusted to us, in contrast to the deification of nature accompanied by the debasement of man. Defense of the public presence of transcendence, above all in the form most familiar to us, the Christian religion, as a path to God to be kept open for future generations, in contrast to anti-religious secularism. Commitment to the purity of the Christian doctrine as the preservation of genuine tradition and transcendence and of the experience of the afterlife, in contrast to the current distortions of the churches. Responsibility for the protection of our Western tradition as a monumental testimony to the collective search for transcendence, in contrast to the dystopia of cancel culture, self-hatred, and the global melting pot. These then are some of the most evident political implications of the transcendent assumptions outlined above, assumptions that today are often condemned as far right. Yet one final point is as important as all the others, if not more so. We must not devote ourselves, body and soul, to these temporal struggles, however deeply we may suffer from them, and however justified our concern for our society and our children may be. Our task is indeed to keep open the path to divine love and transcendence. But our salvation is not measured by political success. It is measured by the degree to which we have already found rest in God here and now, without which everything external is nothing, but with which even the greatest catastrophes remain mere surface phenomena. From this perspective, the decline of the West is indeed a tragedy, but ultimately nothing other than a vast opportunity. An opportunity to recognize the vanity of all that exists, even in its most magnificent forms, and to build for ourselves a fortress not without but within. Now, it is hardly necessary to summarize these reflections. By now, it should be evident that only a radical return to what has long been called the salvation of the soul can provide a credible and immutable foundation for a genuinely conservative worldview, one unassailable by the changing winds of any leftist zeitgeist. Such a worldview, while animated by love for those who err, must nevertheless make no compromises in principle. It must not confine itself to the belated imitation of progressive positions, but must instead confront the materialist and socialist visions of the left and green movement with convictions grounded in an entirely different transcendent order. Only by arguing from the highest ground of being, namely from the divinity, and by keeping this focus steadily before us, can we avoid the error of unconsciously adopting the very argumentative structures of our opponents, thereby confirming their ideology even as we seek to refute it. What is needed is a radical break from the vocabulary of the merely physical and a return to transcendence as the ultimate measure and standard of all human actions. That such an orientation is, at least in part, conservative should be evident, since it necessarily affirms and perpetuates the natural realities of sexuality, family, the love of your homeland, and so forth. Yet precisely for this reason, the term conservatism no longer seems adequate to describe this philosophy in its entirety. A century ago, a believer in God could indeed still be called conservative, for society as a whole was still anchored in transcendence, and the conservative task was to preserve that condition. Today, however, much of what the last century has produced is scarcely worthy of preservation. Our concern, then, must be with conscious discernment. Only that which is already inwardly filled with the striving towards transcendence and the love of God, not of matter, deserves our protection and our affection. Conversely, everything that seeks to block or distort the path to God must be opposed in the most radical way, even and especially when it treacherously disguises itself in the outward forms of religious faith. If therefore we wish to retain the word conservatism, even as the concrete realities it once sought to conserve fade even further into the past, we should at least affirm this, that genuine conservatism must always be identical with transcendentalism, and that every authentic transcendentalism will necessarily include a conservative dimension, since it lives in communion with all past efforts to approach God. Those who root their being and their actions in transcendence cannot help but stand in solidarity with every earlier attempt to walk the same path. For the European conservative, this means above all accept Christianity as the most evident and immediate way of reaching that eternal goal. Thank you very much.
Professor Engels, if you would join me. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to use this opportunity once again to thank the Faculty of Political Sciences of University of Banja and the Center for Socio-Political Research of the Republic of Srpska, and most of all our esteemed guest, Professor Engels, for his lecture. I would like to use also this opportunity to open the space for your questions. Za one koji budu htjeli da postave pitanje na srpskom, postoji ta mogućnost, samo da znate. I would generally suggest your questions to be precise, concise, and to the point, so that as many as possible of you can actually ask your questions.
And of course, we can speak about politics and not only theology.
Exactly. I believe.
Can I first?
Professor Simovic.
What do you think about Donald Trump and his influence of right-wing and far-right political parties in Europe?
The question. Okay. So you have heard that I said that what I consider as true conservatism lacks true identification figures. And even though I would have voted for Donald Trump without any question, I do not think he is a positive conservative identification figure. I would never say to my kids, look at Donald Trump, one day when you are great, when you are adult, become like him. I would not say that. I would vote for him, but I would not say you have to become like that. Then I would rather say, think about King Arthur, think about Saint Louis, think about Charlemagne, for example, or perhaps even Charles V, who knows, but certainly not Donald Trump. I think that embodies already this issue. Yes, there is this beginning of a turn back to Christianity and to absolute values as a foundation of politics. I think that is a positive aspect that shows that we are slowly going to this, what I call the Augustan phase of politics, if we think about the Roman Empire, that we are now at the end of the Roman Republic, where basically modernity leads itself ad absurdum, and so paves the way to some form of final synthesis between modernity and tradition. And so I think that Donald Trump already, perhaps not Donald Trump, but the people around him, like Vance, for example, or like Kirk or others, so they already announced that slowly we are shifting from a world where basically it's majorities that dictate what is true to rather a system where absolute truth comes from above and not just from the parliament. So it announces that already, but we are far from being there very, very clearly with Trump. So if you ask me about my opinion with Trump, speaking as an ancient historian, as a Roman historian, I would say if we look for correspondences between Donald Trump and classical antiquity, I would say this is already at the brink of Trump's first presidency with something like Catilina and Claudius, so the last populist demagogues. His second presidency is already nearly Caesarian or Caesarist, like Caesar, but in opposition to Augustus, I mean. So Caesar, this conflict between a small number of highly influential, rich people who control economic means, public opinion, money, production, whatever, and fight with each other for absolute domination. And I think he is such a Caesar figure. He's certainly not the last one. I guess that the history will really start to become interesting once he's away. Then we will see something like the confrontation in classical antiquity between Mark Antony, Lepidus, Octavian, all these post-Caesarist politicians. And then we might have indeed some form of Augustus who then would start to initiate really this final phase of our civilization. That is how I see Donald Trump with the eyes of a Roman historian through historical comparatism, and of course also in view of, let's say, this announced transition to, again, a transcendentalist foundation of politics and not just a mere conservative or populist. And Donald Trump is not yet there, very obviously. And at the same time, I don't want to monopolize this, of course, but I think it's important to insist on that. At the same time, even someone like Augustus in the Roman Principate remains a very ambivalent figure. On the one hand, yes, Augustus, as may well be the case in Europe in perhaps 10, 15 or 20 years on the West, has been a figure that pretends to restore the Roman religion, to restore tradition, to tie history back to its origins, to put it on a sane or conservative footing. So this is, I would say, from my and probably our perspective, something that is positive. But of course, on the other hand, Augustus stands at the end of a period of civil wars where the entire Roman institutions have discredited themselves and is all but a, let's say, a democratic republican rule, or it remains a rule based on military power, even though also on popular assent. And I think that shows a little bit why especially the Roman senators and especially the conservative senators were all a bit ambivalent. Yes, Augustus and this conservative revolution is the best we can get given the situation of civil war. But on the other hand, it's not really the return to the good old ages that we would like to. And I think this ambivalence is something that Trump already announces a little bit, and that may become even greater in the future.
Further questions?
In today's Europe, what we can expect from European Union, knowing that actually we have one kind of opposition in countries like Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, in some cases even Slovenia and Austria, knowing that those countries are predominantly conservative and political Brussels, Belgium, France, and Germany in one part is much greater opposition to those values that are propagated by Hungary and so on.
Mm-hmm. Just as a little correction, in Belgium now we have a conservative government with Bart de Wever, which was considered some years ago still as being really far right and really evil and Nazi and fascist. So basically what we have in power now was considered as being as bad as Viktor Orban some years ago. So Belgium might not be the best example, but yeah, I get the meaning. I would. It's an enormous question, and basically this really leads to the book, because what I've explained to you now was rather the basics from which I argue, whereas in the book I'm much more concrete and speaking much more now about really what goes wrong and how we could reform that in a more concrete way. Now, different elements. Once, I've lived 7 years in Poland. I'm just back from Poland to Belgium, and I must confess that, yeah, the conservative government in power for 7 years, or 6 years rather, the time I was there, delayed a bit the worst what happened, but there was no rollback at all. The Polish society in these 6 years has not become more conservative. It has become more leftist also, just perhaps in a slower path than if we would have Donald Tusk all the time. But basically, the path downwards has been the same. So it's not an up and down. So Poland has declined. There are no kids anymore. People don't go as much to church as they used to go before. You have all this LGBT stuff. Migration is starting. History is starting to be deconstructed. The whole bunch, basically, of Western dissolution is also happening in Poland. And from what I see in Hungary, I don't think it's fundamentally different. I'm not sure if Viktor Orban will still in power next year. I have big doubts. I hope that he will remain in power, but I'm not so sure about that. And I've seen how quickly the whole Polish system has been dismantled in 2 weeks. So I don't think that it will be fundamentally different else. So there is a general trend towards this westernizing, left liberal, ecologists, post-colonial woke, whatever, self-destruction, I think, everywhere in the West. And for the moment, I see rather, that's very different to what I would have said 7 years ago, signs of hope in the middle of where it is worst. That is in France, for example. France is really at the brink of the abyss, even Macron speaks all the time about the risk of civil war. So I'm not inventing that. Macron speaks about that regularly. There is a real risk of at least civil unrest, if not some forms of civil war in France. But at the same time, there is, at least in a small elite, but that's all that counts, a growing understanding of what is happening. Young people, at least in France, are starting to go back again to the Mass, and they are going to the Tridentine Mass. They want Mass in Latin. They don't want Second Vaticanum Masses. They are starting to become patriot again. They are starting to found families early on and having plenty of kids. That is something that does not really happen in Poland, for example, or Hungary, or at least not in this dimension. So I think there are signs of hope when we look at what is happening from a social point of view. I think that hope may come from parts of Europe where things are worse, because even if you are not a historic determinist, I'm called Engels, but that's just incidental. But if you have these tendencies, then it's a bit logical that hope does come from the country where capitalism is the most evolved, no? And not from even though the Russian Revolution, but that's something different. So yeah, now when we come to the European Union, I have a very ambivalent attitude to the European Union. I'm not against it. I think it's a wonderful instrument in the right hands. It's just that for the moment, it's in the wrong hands. And so I can understand those people saying that, yeah, well, it's in the wrong hands. And so the European Union does so many horrible things that the logical reaction, which I can understand, is no, let's go back to nation state, sovereigntism, and the European Union was a failure and so on. But I think that's a wrong reaction, even if understandable. We have to realize that is one of the core messages of this book, that the European nation states, in the context of the 21st century, are basically a joke. In comparison to China, Confucius Institute next door, what is Serbia? What is Luxembourg? What is the Netherlands? What is even France? Nothing. And it will be still less in 10 or 20 years. That is so obvious. So if we go back to full-fledged national autonomies, there will be competition again. And the people from Poland will have even more fear from Germany, and the Germans and the France, and the French will be more in competition, and the Netherlands will fear both and will start to ally with the UK, and the Austrians will ally with whoever, and the Poles will be even more allied with the US, and the Czechs will perhaps start to have an alliance with China, and this kind of thing. So Europe would be divided and fragmented into 30-something nation states, all bought by some of their big neighbors and pitted against each other. That is the risk if we do not have this cooperation. And so we will win back national autonomy, but it will be worth nothing at all, because then Belgium will not be, or let's say Slovenia will not be dependent on Brussels, but on Beijing. Not sure if that's much better somehow. So I think we need to work on taking over the European Union. That is basically the idea, taking it over, reforming it, transforming it into a tool, not of dismantling and hollowing out of our civilization, but rather of defending. We have to turn it upside down, basically, and inside out. That is more or less my message. I know that many people will say, perhaps rightly so, nah, that's utopian, we'll never manage that, it's pitted against, there will always be leftist majorities. Yeah, perhaps, but it still seems to me marginally more useful than going back to the nation state, which I think is also not really an option. Not even a realistic option, and even if it is realized, will only lead one way or the other to some form of total lack of international importance and autonomy. I mean, already now, China says, okay, we stop delivering rare earth to you, then it's already over anyway. If you have your own nation state or not, then you are becoming a colony of someone else, and it's the case with all the other stuff. So that's why I say both battles are perhaps lost, one of these battles, I think, with the current evolution of the European Union, may be a bit more promising, because we see that slowly people are starting to wake up a little bit. The conservative movements or populist right movements are becoming more and more important a bit everywhere. So with time, that could be marginally more promising than the other one. But I have to confess, it's really marginal, and probabilities are perhaps against us, but I don't see any other alternative.
Da, vi izvolite.
Well, thank you so much. I have one question about culture, not politics, about culture. Because some things that you said about God, of metaphysical gods, that things are written in Dostoevsky's book. So my question is, what do you think about this part of, what do you think is a Russian culture part of European culture? Your opinion.
I think not. I think that Russia is its own civilization. I don't think that it is part of the European civilization. That is perhaps even good news for Russia from a certain point of view, because it may perhaps escape what is happening in the West. But at the origin, I rather thought, okay, no, basically it's all one Western civilization. At the beginning, I was rather against what also Oswald Spengler, because he from the beginning on said, no, Russia is another civilization. I was a bit skeptical about that, but during these last years, more and more it seems to me that Russia is its own civilization. Of course, it shares a lot of similarities with our own. There's the Indo-European language, there's Christianity, of course, there's shared history and so forth. That is obvious, but still, I believe it is a civilization of its own. Perhaps a civilization that has not even started growing. I'm not sure. For me, it's a big interrogation mark. But already the fact that we cannot very clearly say, yeah, no, that's obviously European, shows that there is something. Either it's really far at the periphery and not totally within, or it is something new.
But if we say Russian opera and music, Tchaikovsky, it's more like
European.
yes.
That is what Oswald Spengler would call the pseudomorphosis. That is, other civilizations that borrow their forms from another one, but that fill them with their own spirit, like Christianity. Christianity also, as some form of new civilization, borrows the form of Platonic philosophy, of Roman institutions, of Roman art, but does something different with them. And so I would say, I mean, if you look at China, you even have Chinese classical music from the late 19th century. You have Japanese composers writing romantic Japanese music in the Western style in the 1910s already. So you have the influence of Western art on. I mean, look at the Turkish palaces constructed on the Bosporus in the late 19th century. They try also, even the Summer Palace in Beijing, they try to copy paste Baroque elements and so on. So this radiation of a civilization outward is a bit everywhere. And so from that point of view, I would be quite near to Dostoevsky. I think he has a point in making this big difference and saying we are something different and opposing the Westernizers within Russian civilization, saying no, they are trying to impose upon us something that doesn't really correspond. We need to go our own way. So I think it is something different. But that is also an explanation why I think that Russia can probably never be part of any European civilization state. It can be perhaps some ally, hopefully, one day. There might be some form of friendship and mutual exchange and whatnot. But already the idea of the entirety of Europe is divided into these small nation states. They have all their little borders, they have all their identity, they have generally their language, their tradition, and then you have this enormous chunk, Russia, where you wonder, what is this? It is all but the nation. It is not a nation state in the classical sense. Imagine only admitting representatives of Russia to the European Union Parliament, that suddenly you have 150 millions sending their deputies over there, that would implode everything, because the logical system even behind the Russian mir system is so unlike everything we have developed in the last centuries in Europe that I don't really see how this could fit together. I mean, there have always been projects like Peter the Great and up to Yeltsin, of course, who've tried to modernize and to westernize, but it has failed every time, and I think probably for a reason. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm not doing Russia bashing. I don't want to do Russia idealizing either. I'm a European and I feel as a European patriot, so that is my point of view. But I think that from my perspective at least, Russia would be something different. Without saying it's better.
We don't have time for oil on the fire. By all means.
We were really close, but I would like to add something else. As far as I understood, please let me know if I'm wrong. Talking about European civilization and Europe, we have to first speak about Roman Greek law, which basically gave the civilization to Europe and then Western world and so on and so on. What is maybe not well known, Russian society, state culture was based on Roman Greek law, which is basically completely in common with our Western friends. And also what might be interesting, they got the Roman Greek law throughout Serbs and Sensava and Novokano or Zakonov at the mid of 13th century. And their church, their state, their laws, everything is based on Justinian civil law and Orthodox Christian or church canons. So in that sense, yes, it's a Europe. It's a civilization. Maybe even before the Western Europe, in some sense. Inside, we all would like to think that we are the only one of the best. But on the other hand, as David said, I mean, Russia is so huge. Its empire, different culture, different, I don't know, in general, and so on and so forth. So their civilization itself. And as far as I understood, he never wanted to say it's something better or worse, but it's just something different, especially for Western Europe, because you have like centuries of not understanding what's going on there. So, I mean, you wish or not, but if you don't understand completely something, you're just human being, and you need time and opportunity to understand what's that. Okay, we are close to Russia, and we don't have that sort of fear. So, and we are Orthodox and Slavs and so on. But we have to understand that also we don't know much about culture to understand. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you for being patient.
A technical notice also, for those willing to delve deeper into the book of the Professor Engels, there are 10 copies delivered to the library of your faculty here as a gift from Center for Socio-Political Research. So for those that don't get answers to their questions at this session, you might find them in the book in your library. We shall now continue with questions. Kolega, vi ste prije kolegice, da, jeste li vi podigli?
Is it true that one of the most powerful political parties in Germany has elements of Nazi ideology? And do you think it can affect the war?
So you speak about AfD and
Yes.
to what degree AfD has National Socialist elements in it. I would say, I mean, AfD has a complex history. It's a young party. I think it has been founded in 2013, 14, something like that. 13, I think. but it has already long history behind itself. At the beginning, it was essentially a liberal, libertarian, vaguely conservative party, essentially interested with economic questions, like opposing the euro to the benefit of the Deutsche Mark and some return to a more loose economic union. And then after 2015 and Angela Merkel's opening of the borders and so forth, this party focused more and more on the criticism of migration and took over elements of more of, let's say, some form of national patriotism and not just of economic self-interest, you could say. And, and then it evolved also into that direction. And so for the moment, yes, the AfD has a political program that is still rather liberal with a secular form of conservatism, but nothing really original, I would say. But it is a party you can't really grasp. That is, you have, how to say, you have people that are totally atheistic, I would say even most of them. Then you have some Christian traces. It's a party where you have many liberals, but you also have people that are rather social nationalists. It's a party where you have people that are more nationalist, you have some who are a bit civilizationalist, you have a bit of everything. Even though I would say the core component of that party is the electorate in Eastern Germany, and these people are already post-religious, post-Protestant patriots or nationalists from a certain point of view. That is, they are not very civilizationalist, they are rather German, so for them, it's not necessarily, as I would prefer them to be, some form of European patriotism, but rather of German patriotism. They use words like Abendland or Europe rather when they want to define themselves in contrast to Islam, for example. That's when they speak a bit about civilization. But it's more about the place of Germany than of Europe. And their referral to Christianity is more like, we prefer, our civilization is Christian because these are the Muslims, so we are the Christians, but Christianity is good because it's a religion that gives us freedom to do whatever we want. This kind of self-justification. So Christianity is considered positively by these atheist people as being a religion that has fused with enlightenment and rationality, which is not exactly my point of view, as you may have understood from my lecture. So there are some traces of people who are a bit revisionists, who try to revise the obviously negative view on the 12 years of National Socialism, trying to say, yes, well, you have to understand Hitler, or not everything was bad, or nah, it's rather towards the end of the war, or nah, the others were bad also. So there are some elements of self-justification and relativization of National Socialism. But from my point of view, it's rather fringe. I don't think at all it's in the core of this movement. But it's difficult to say what is in the core of that movement, in fact. And I think that the greatest power of the AfD for the moment is that it is a bit difficult to say what they want. You can clearly see what they are against. And that is their big power, because it's one of the only parties who will say no to mass migration, no to exaggerate LGBT stuff, no to European woke bureaucracy, and so forth, no to exaggerate social spending. So they're against that, but it's difficult to say what they would like in contrast. And so I think that the AfD would basically have exactly as many votes, even if they did basically no political campaigning at all. Because that is their strength for the moment. It will not last, of course. One day or the other, they will have to say what they want. Are they now Christian or are they secular? Are they rather social or are they rather liberal? Are they now for German sovereigntism or for limited European integration? That moment has not yet come. But I don't think it is in its core fundamentally National Socialist. No, there are traces. I wouldn't downplay that, but it's. I would say some of these people may even have a certain influence, and it is sure that some people who would be National Socialists would vote for them because it's the best option basically they would have. But I don't think there's a lot of power. It's basically, I hope that not too many Germans will listen to me, it's basically a Eastern German boomer, right, conservative boomer party, I would call it, for the moment.
I think neoliberal media, mainstream media, created atmosphere where everybody and everything who is a sovereign and who is anti-immigration is Nazi. That's the problem. And that's not the truth. We have a problem here. Every of us is anti-immigrant, and we are very traditional, very proud to our nation, and all mainstream media in Europe talks Serbian is a Nazi. No, Serbian is anti-fascistic people. That's it.
I mean, there's a double there's a double problem. As now everyone is basically Nazi, this is some form of relativization of true National Socialism,
Yes.
which is a problem because young people growing up with hearing that he is a Nazi and that is a Nazi and saying that is a Nazi, in the end they think, well, if everyone is a Nazi, perhaps National Socialism was also more or less as moderate as the people that are considered now as Nazis. That's the problem. If basically you are called Nazi every day, then you may think, well, perhaps it was already that exaggerated between 33 and 45. So perhaps in the end, all this is fake history and National Socialism wasn't that bad. That is the problem of this reductio ad Hitlerum that we see a bit everywhere. And of course, at the same time, the media have also pushed the AfD to the right. That is the AfD is in large parts also a creation of the German media, who have so much said that they are Nazis and National Socialists and they are this and that. That indeed people have entered that party that may think like that, and there is some form of endeavor to push them into that sense. I don't see that this fully works, but I would strongly hope that the AfD would one day develop a program that would go beyond just this form of indistinct liberalism and become a bit clearer about what they think. But in conclusion, I think that from a realistic point of view, I don't think that there will be yet another conservative party in the future of Germany in the next 5 or 10 years. That is, the future of Germany lies in how they will manage, or perhaps not, to integrate the AfD and their electorate into the political fabric. Because I don't see that suddenly there will be yet another conservative party and the AfD will disappear and we will have another party. I think it's either them or nobody, for good and bad somehow. And that the AfD, what I mean is the AfD is a political factor in Germany we have to reckon with. And it's somehow about, will they be integrated or not, that will define, at least for the next 5 or 10 years, the German history. So they cannot be ignored.
Colleague, your question.
Thank you. I have one question. What are the consequences of migration for the Middle East, on the Europe, European Union, and the people in Europe?
So the long-term consequences of mass migration as we see it in Europe, you mean?
Yeah.
I think that for most Western European countries, history is said, as they say, that the mass is set. That is, mass migration and the strong presence of Islam will remain forever, or at least for the next 100 or 200 years. Western Europe will never be a homogeneous white, for whatever that means, Christian society anymore. That is ended, that possibility. Perhaps 30 years ago, they could choose otherwise, but now it's too late. UK anyway, UK is slowly ceasing to be a European country, basically. If you go to Birmingham, for example, or whatever, or whatever other town, Bradford, it's already over. So it's a new, it will be possible, it's a new form of society that is emerging. We don't know where this leads. But in France, you have the same problem. Most big towns in France are to large parts peopled by people not from Europe, either of sub-Saharan African or essentially, of course, of Muslim descent. And even though their natality is also shrinking, exactly as the natality of French people, but still is considerably higher as that. And I suppose that in at least 2 generations, we will approach a situation of 1/3, 2/3, perhaps even worse, and with a disproportion between, of course, people of migrant descent living essentially in the big towns and dominating them, and the native autochthonous people moving to the countrysides. And that is something I think that cannot be stopped anymore. That is ended. I mean, little example that I often give: the town in Belgium I've been born in, near to which I'm living it now once again, 70,000 inhabitants. The town itself is largely Islamized, so there are not many Europeans or Belgians still living there, especially in the last 10, 15 years. Most of the Belgians are moving to the countryside, to nice little villages, whereas the town is left basically to the migrant communities. And so you have already now several schools where you have not one Belgian in a school class. That is a reality, and I don't see how that will change. So basically for these countries, I wouldn't say it is over, but the focus of conservative parties or right-wing parties should be about integration. That is the only thing we can do. Many of them are speaking about remigration and reconquista and whatever, and that may sound, for some people at least, nice on the paper, but it's not feasible anymore. Towns like Marseille, Lyon, Rennes, even Paris, they will never be what they may have been 50 years ago. So the question should be, how will it be possible somehow to create a civilizational framework that remains recognizably European, somehow civilizationally, into which these communities can somehow integrate. This is why I often speak about Romanitas, and this what happened also under the Roman Empire, that is this idea that, okay, identity will have to be decoupled from ethnocultural aspect rather to civilizational ones, and be coupled with some form of, the more you integrate at least into a general European framework of identity, the more you are integrated, which implies, of course, also somehow coming to terms with Islam and with what Islam says. But I'm not sure, and less sure, whether this will be possible to have in an organic way, or if especially France will have go to a long period of economic decline, civil unrest, perhaps forms of secession of certain parts of France that may become independent, and civil war, and only perhaps in 15, 20 years, something, a new consensus arising out of that mess. And of course, we all know that civil wars or civil unrest periods can produce everything. So once we start that, we have no idea what will be at the end of that.
Professor Dakic.
Well, I just was wondering, how do you see the role and place of Christian Orthodoxy in the future Europe, or in the project which you are proposing?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. to know how the three Christian confessions we have within the European Union sphere will continue to develop. That is Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodoxy. Frankly, I think it will be essentially a question of demographics somehow. Protestantism for the moment is dying out, very clearly so. They are surviving in the form of evangelical churches here and there, but classical Protestantism is disappearing. It might be very well possible in 20, 25 years that classical Lutheranism will be dead. I think that is a possibility that it will disappear after 500 years. Could very well be. Catholicism is shrinking, but it is at the same time becoming more conservative, I would say. So during the next generation, when we have this transference or transfer from the boomer generation to the young generation, the youngest generation, because I would say my generation, the generation of the 70s, 80s, 90s is in all respects, how to say, a bit ignored. The transition will happen between the boomer generation and the millennial generation. What is in between will be skipped, I think. And at least within the Catholic Church, this will lead to a growing conservatism, even self-radicalization of the Catholic Church. I think that in one generation or two generations, the Catholic Church in Europe will basically go back to the Tridentine rites and to traditional Catholicism. I think that the post-Vaticanum Church is already dead now, and they are dying out with the boomer generation. They will disappear. So that will lead, of course, to a growing radicalization of the Catholic Church. That will be more and more, again, recognizably Catholic and not semi-Protestant or whatever. And of course, this affects a lot of huge European countries like Spain, Italy, France, so as big players. The fate of Orthodoxy, I think it will depend a bit on demographics. I mean, Bulgaria is dying out slowly. I'm not so sure about the demographics of the rest of the Balkan, but doesn't seem wonderful either. So the whole, let's say, I know that some Catholics have this hope that a renewal of their own religion could come over Orthodoxy, and I know there are some people who are looking for a new way towards Christianity are finding that in Orthodoxy, that has conserved a greater continuity and a greater authenticity of its ritual than the Catholicism that has destroyed basically its continuity with the Second Vaticanum. But I'm not sure if that will be a long-term movement, because already now these people rather find back to the Tridentine rite. That was unknown for a long time. That was a thing of some angry old people from the 60s, 70s that followed Lefebvre and that had this bad reputation. But by now, it's essentially young people under 30 that have plenty of kids and that are very patriotic. So I think there might be some hope of renewal. Now, how will this religious coexistence between them and Orthodoxy play out? I don't know. I don't know also enough about the Balkans to say to what extent now Orthodoxy will be able to identify itself on a long run with the European Union that is rooted in the tradition of Western Christianity, essentially of Roman Catholicism, and of course on the other side Russia, that is posing as defender, the biggest defender somehow of a certain approach of Orthodoxy. So I think that may depend also on the fate of Russia itself, that is also slowly starting to be less and less Orthodox in reality. I mean, if you look at how many people go to Easter or to church on Sunday, I think it's much less than in Poland, for example. So, I mean, Russian Orthodoxy is clearly also wounded, strongly wounded. Islam is rising, as you all know, within Russia. Russia is also slowly and ever stronger under pressure by China through Siberia. So how long will Russia be able to maintain a status as world power as it doesn't even succeed in winning this limited war against Ukraine. So I think that probably the attitude of European Orthodox people will probably depend also on how this will play out. But I've no true response to that, and without wanting to be chauvinist, but it is clear that the European Union project is rather a post-Carolingian project that has its roots in this Romano-German Catholic Rome-centered couple, with Orthodoxy being a bit awkwardly joined to that from a cultural point of view.
So you basically don't see much of the cultural or civilization complementary between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy.
I think we have to live together. I think there can be a lot of things learned. I think, for example, that something like Hesychast traditions, the Jesus prayer, things like that have had an enormous influence also on Catholic traditions. So there is certainly a complementarity. There is a historical nexus, but it is clear that if we look at center and periphery, that countries like Portugal, like the Scandinavian countries, like Poland, like the Balkan countries, like the south of Italy, are situated at a certain periphery with peripheral traditions. I mean, much of the south of Italy belongs from a certain point of view already to the other side of the Mediterranean, exactly like parts of the south of Spain. And so these are these fringe regions whose allegiance to the center goes rather through an emotional wish to be part of it than of having a 1,000 years immediate shared history.
Okay, so,
Professor Dakic.
sorry, just one quick comment to
Go ahead.
to the table to think of. Because in my view, if we are talking about being, essence, so differentiation between Orthodoxy and Catholicism is actually differentiation in manifestation, not in the essence, not in the being.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I really have difficulties to understand this division in history back and to see it in the future, especially in the context of the demography and Islamization, increasing Islamization. So if we maintain that division.
No, we should. I mean, this division is there. It is rooted in history. It is up to us to make it work. It is up to us somehow to transform this European bloc into something that is also not just a community of history, which it isn't in many parts, but into a community of a common wish, you see, of a common destiny. So if we just look back, then of course it is difficult to say that we belong together, because indeed many Belgians would probably not know where to put Bosnia-Herzegovina on the map of Europe, unfortunately. So if we just look back at the history, it's difficult. I think we have for the future to find what allies is. I mean, Greece is such a part, for example. Greece as being a country that has been cut from the Carolingian Europe for a millennium nearly, and that has joined, and that has so different traditions in many respects, not just religious, but also historical, with the whole Byzantine heritage and not the Western Roman heritage, but still that wanted to be part of, that is happy to be within the European Union, exactly as Bulgaria and Romania and many other countries are happy to be in there and want to belong rather to that sphere, for example, than to belong to the Russian sphere. And I think it is up to us to have this common, let's say, this common objective, and to make this triangle between Catholicism, Protestantism, and the European Orthodoxies and Orthodox national churches that are not imperial national churches like the Russian one, but limited nation state national churches somehow work. So from that point of view, I, for myself, absolutely want them in. And I think that already now it is a success, but it needs more in the future than just economic success. It would need a common adherence precisely to transcendence. And if you may have noticed that also what I talked about was not about Catholicism. It was rather about transcendence in its largest sense. And I think that is something that within the Christian tradition we may all probably agree on, even if there are differences between the confessions that won't go away, but that are also the riches of this European continent.
Thank you very much.
The final question for this evening.
Sorry, but Professor Engels and you and Professor Dutch gave good input to my question. Considering Bosnia and Herzegovina's position between European, Russian, and Islamic influences, do you think that Europe can truly integrate such diverse identities, or does it need new kind of ideological method, something like confederal identity that you promote in your work?
Well, I'm not sure if it is a good news or bad news, but the rest of Europe is also increasingly looking like Bosnia and Herzegovina when it comes to identity. So let's say the importance of Islam in everyday life is now as strong in France basically than over here. So that is something. I would say that the problems experienced in Bosnia and Herzegovina are now also experienced a bit everywhere else in Europe. So we have to somehow to develop something that may be considered as a bit artificial, something like a common European identity, but that is rooted in history and tradition and in transcendence and not just in some Kantian universal state message. And we need to develop something like that very quickly, so that not only the different nation states can find themselves in that, but that somehow we will be able to integrate these immigrant communities into them, because they are there. They are very strong, especially in France or in Belgium or in the Netherlands. If we want it or not, they are extremely influential. They will be even more influential in one generation. And so we need as quickly as possible to develop some form of European patriotism based on the Christian tradition, into which these communities can, by complementarity, by some form of mutual definition, integrate themselves. Because I'm still convinced that it is easier for Muslim communities to be integrated into a still majority Christian society and civilization than into a secular civilization. Because secularism for Islam is a vacuum, basically, and they evolve like that, because they feel, rightly so, by the way, antagonized by this total lack of values and of transcendence. So they become hardened, they become more extremist somehow, whereas within a Christian continuity, where we share at least certain points, like we share the belief in transcendence, we share the importance of family, we share the respect of natural law, we share a certain love for tradition, even if it's another, we can speak. And one thing that sometimes is difficult to understand for some people, but in the end, at the end of the day, when I speak with a Muslim, I may have different opinion, but I have the impression that he understands what I mean. But when I speak with a woke person, I have this impression, no, he's on another planet. We cannot speak because we have no ground. I might fight with a Muslim, but at least we are fighting on a ground that is comparable. If I fight verbally, of course, with a woke person, I don't even know how to start speaking, because there's just an abyss of different values or the absence of values below. That is why I think that we need this foundation into an integrative European tradition and Christianity, in order to get things right, and thus to find also a solution, of course, for states like Bosnia and Herzegovina that may for a long time have seemed as being some form of weird accident within Europe, but that are now finally not that curious and that eccentric as it seems. Because just to close the circle, I think in 20 years probably France will have exactly the same problems as Bosnia and Herzegovina now.
ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I would like first of all to apologize because I know there are more questions, but where I am willing to let you ask those questions, the time is not. We are nearing the end of our allotted time frame here. I would like to thank you once again to all of you who have participated. As you had the opportunity to, while listening to Professor and his lecture, and then his answers to your already asked questions, you have been in position to hear a lecture or to perceive a vision of a man who comes from a rather cultural milieu that is rather similar to ours, that is more or less in the same continental framework as we are, and though you were not invited to accept, but to contemplate the problems that Professor Engels has pointed out and that are now crucial and are striking at more or less every country in the Western Europe, are the problems that could tomorrow be the problems that come to our own territory. Thus, all the things that we have spoken about this evening are invitation for you, for your colleagues, not just in this moment, invitation to think on them, not just in this moment, but in your future studies and in your future conversations with your families, with your friends, with your colleagues, and even with people that you do not agree with, politically or otherwise. As Professor Engels pointed out, the difference between talking with someone who is woke, so to speak, and the Muslim is like is a difference in a conversation with people, with someone who might understand the basics of what you're trying to convey, but does not agree with you on the more nuanced approaches. While on the other side, you have complete separation of, complete negation, cancellation on everything that you are, that you believe is worthy, and that you believe your culture is built upon, that should be preserved for the future in one shape or the other. With that, I would also like to invite you tomorrow, for those of you who are able, at 11 o'clock at Academy of Sciences and Arts of the Republic of Srpska, where Professor Engels will have a promotion of his book, the book that you can see here, and likewise we'll have a discussion similar to this one. With that, I would like to conclude, to thank you once again, and to wish you a pleasant evening. Thank you all.